The War Millennia by Brian Aldiss. To begin then, though there's certainly no beginning, the first fragment is of a strange past world, where clouds of nationalism have gathered and broken into a storm of war over the forgotten continents, Asia, America, Africa. Missiles of destruction fly. The beleaguered people of that day have not fully comprehended the nature of the struggle in which they are engulfed. Those simple blacks, whites, and greys which constitute the political situation are grasped readily enough with a little application, but behind these issues lie factors scarcely understood in the council chambers of Peking, London, Cairo, or Washington. Factors which stem from the long and savage past of the race, factors of instinct and frustrated instinct, factors of fear and lust and dawning conscience, factors inseparable from the adolescence of a species, which loom behind all men's affairs, like an insurmountable mountain chain. Though men fought each other instead of wrestling with themselves, the bravest sought to evade the currents of hatred by turning outward to the nearest planets in the solar system. The cowardly by slipping away their lives in vast hives, called dreameries, where the comforts of fantasy could discount the depredations of war. Neither course ultimately offered refuge. When the earthquake comes, it topples both tower and hovel. It is fitting that the first fragment should start with the man sitting helplessly in a chair while bombs fall. The director of Dreamery 5 slid out of his chair before the silent control panels, the question of Floyd Milton making him ungovernably restless. Every so often a distant crump outside announced that the enemy attack was still on. That made the director no more easy, although he would be safer down in the vaults, peering into Floyd Milton's dreams. Other considerations caused him to take the elevator and sink to the cool depths of Dreamery 5. He had seen Milton's face when he came in that afternoon. Milton had looked like death. The sleep levels were as humid as usual and reeked of the spirit used by the robot masseurs. "You slugs," the director said aloud in the direction of the rows of sleepers. They lay dormant, heads concealed in the feedback phones. Occasionally a sleeper would be rolled up until his toes rested on his shoulders and his behind pointed into the air. Rubber-covered machinery would flick up and pummel him. Then it stretched him out again and pummeled his chest, carefully avoiding the intravenous feed pipes which hung from the ceiling. Whatever their mental state, sleepers were maintained in a good physical condition, and all the time they slept and dreamed their dark dreams. "Slugs," the director said again. It would never have done to have a director who loved the sleepers in his charge. Alone in the vast automated dreameries, he would have been too likely to pry into the reveries of these hopeless introverts. Apart from a few young people moved by genuine curiosity, only psychopaths and misfits lay in the dreameries, playing out their lives in useless reverie. Unfortunately, they accounted for a fair percentage of the population. The 60 years Cold War, now broken into something horribly hot, had produced an amazing number of mental invalids who were only too glad to retreat by the escape route of the dreameries into their own fantasy world. Floyd Milton had not looked the type, nor had he looked like one of the tough spacers who, after the ardours of a long run to Mars or Ganymede, came here sometimes to recuperate for a while. He looked like a man who had betrayed himself and knew it. That was why the director had to see his dreams. Sometimes real men, could be saved from themselves before they sank too low. The director paused in front of Milton's bed. The latest arrival was silent, breathing shallowly, his face hidden under the visor and feedback phones. Noting his number, the director hurried into the nearest control booth and dialed it. He assumed a visor and fumes himself. In a moment he would be plugged automatically into Milton's reveries. From the look on Milton's face when he had entered Dreamwave 5, it would not be pleasant, but tuning circuits ensured that the director could always modulate the empathy effect enough to retain his own consciousness. As always, when about to undergo these supervisions, the director hurriedly made a mental survey of his own world. Once in someone else's dreams, he had difficulty in orienting himself. It was not a comfortable world. The ideological barriers erected all over Earth since the 40s of the previous century had precluded any advance in human happiness. In the late 60s, the first manned ships had plunked themselves down on the moon. In the late 80s, the principles of subthreshold suggestion had been applied to the sleeping brain, coupled with feedback techniques. This had permitted a method to be evolved for making one's own dreams more vivid than a 3D film. Within 5 years, Dreamwave 1 had been built. Just before the turn of the century, the Soulites had arrived. They came not in spaceships, but in vessels they termed portmatters, house-like affairs, which broadcast themselves to Earth from the Soulite world. Their science was a parascience, far beyond Earth's understanding. Yet they took an innocent delight in Earth. They loved Earth, the director said. He had seen the Soulites, with Earth's blessings, load their portmatters with Earth's riches, which meant for them not gold or uranium, but Earth's plants and animals and butterflies. They had been adorable people, sophisticated savages, welcoming all of life. When the Cold War suddenly blew hot, they had disappeared, declaring they could never return. That moment, to sensible people everywhere, had seemed the moment that hope died. Earth was alone again, derelict by its own woes. "You are through it, sir," a metallic voice announced. The director braced himself. Next second he was plunged into the dreams of Floyd Milton. It was pleasant. After the creepy vaults of Dreamwave 5 and the murmurs of a global war, it was doubly pleasant. All the same, for the director it was strange, incredibly strange. The plants sported flowers as lovely as girls' mouths. The flowers budded, blossomed, faded, and produced streamers 50 yards long, which billowed lightly in the breeze, scattered perfumed seeds. The plants grew in a circle, and the circle was a room. Only one room. Another room had for its walls a twinkling myriad of fish, little grey fellows with forked black tongues like snakes. They swam in towers of water that wet your finger if you touched them. The matter transmitter fields, 2 molecules thick, held them in place, towering into the vermilion air. Another room seemed to be sheathed in stars. Giant moths flew about and settled on the stars. The stars chimed as they were touched. In another room, tall grasses glistened with the heavy-lidded dews of dawn. In another room, snow fell eternally, magnifying itself as it sank into crystals 3 inches across, which vanished as they touched the floor. In another room, but every room was different, for this was the palace of Amada Malfoy, and the palace was on Soulite. Amada herself was here, just returned from her visit to Earth, loaded down with flowers and tigers. She was giving a party to reunite all her old friends and introduce them to her second husband. The guests numbered under 500. A good proportion of them had brought their husbands, brightly dressed men whose frivolous robes contrasted with the black-draped semi-nudity of the women. Many women and some men came escorted by animals, cheetahs, macaws, or a sort of superb lizard that was 3 feet high, when it walked erect. Animatedly, they thronged through the magnificent rooms. Gay balloons wafted on artificial trade winds, floated glasses of drink about the rejoicing palace. Everyone appeared to be drinking. No one appeared to be drinking too much. Another thing made the party quite unlike an earthly party. Although everyone talked, no one did so at the top of his voice. And dazzled as he watched it all, the director thought he had never seen a fantasy half so fantastic as this. He could tell by its careful detail that it was memory rather than the wish fulfillment stuff most of the inmates of Dreamwave 5 brewed in their dark little brains. Floyd Milton had actually walked through this incredible building. He had walked among these gay avenues of cold-burning argon, playing its rainbow light over the guests' faces. He had strolled along this invisible path above the gurgling stream. He had eaten those fantastic foodstuffs and spoken to guests in his halting version of the Soulite tongue. All these things Milton had done because it was his palace. He was Armada's second husband, and the party was being given in his honour. The guests flocked here to meet him. This was the great night of his life, yet he was not happy. "You look worried, pet," Armada said to him. She might have been a woman of earth, and a lovely woman at that, except for the scanty thatch of hair which curled tightly across her head. Now she wore the martyred look any woman wears when her husband is being awkward at an awkward moment. "I'm not worried, Armada," Milton said. "And please don't call me pet. Your blue tiger here is a pet." "But it's a compliment, Floyd," she said, patting the creature's head. "Is not Subiani a beautiful pet?" "Subiani is a tiger, I am a man. Can't you try and remember that little distinction?" Armada never looked angry, but now the martyred expression deepened. It made her, Milton had to admit, extremely desirable. "The distinction is quite obvious to me," she said. "Life is too short to waste pointing out the obvious." "Well, it's not too obvious to me," Milton said angrily. "What do your people do? You come to Earth, and you proceed to take everything you can. Trees, grass, fish, birds, even husbands," Armada said. "Yes, even husbands. You do all this, Armada, because you people have fallen in love with Earth. You ship about everything you can here. It makes me feel no better than an exotic plant or a poodle." She turned her beautiful back on him. "Now you are acting as intelligent as a poodle," she said. "Armada," he said. When she turned slowly round, Milton said penitently, "I'm sorry, darling. You know why I'm irritable. I keep thinking of the war back on Earth. And the other thing." "And the other thing?" she prompted. "Yes. Why you Soulites are so reticent about where in the universe this world is. Why you wouldn't even point out its direction to me in Earth's night sky. I know that with your port matters distance is immaterial, but I'd just like to know. It may be a detail to you, but it's the sort of thing that bothers me." Armada let an image of a big butterfly settle on her finger as she said carefully, "In Earth's present state of civilization, she cannot reach this world. So why should it matter where we are?" "Oh, I know our little spaceships are just a beginning." He let his voice trail away. The trouble was, Soulite civilization was too big and too beautiful. They might look like Earth people, but they thought and acted differently. They were alien. That basically was what worried Milton. A lingering puritanism made him wonder if he was not perhaps committing some nameless sin in marrying a woman of another planet. After only a month of marriage, he and Armada had several. No, they were not quarrels, just differences. They loved each other. That, yes, but Milton, questioning his own love, wondered if perhaps his hand had not been forced by the knowledge that by marrying her he could get to fabulous Soulite. Only by marrying a citizen of the matriarch-dominated planet could one visit it. Otherwise, it hung remotely in other skies completely out of reach. Despite himself, Milton tried to make his point again. Earth's a poor world, he said, ignoring the boredom on her face. Solar is a rich world, yet you fall in love with all terrestrial things. You import them. You give Earth nothing in exchange, not even your location. We like the things of Earth for aspects in them you do not see, she said. There it was again, the alien line of thought. He shivered, despite the warmth of the room. You don't give Earth anything, Milton repeated, and was at once aware of the meanness of what he had said. I'm trying to give you all this if you will accept it, she answered lightly. Now please come and smile at some people for my sake. Although his worries persisted, Milton soon managed to shake them to the back of his mind. Guilt was his trouble. At home his country was at war, while here everything was created for pleasure. Soullight was immensely enjoyable for its own sake. Milton loved its hedonistic atmosphere, which nevertheless contained an astringent tang. He loved its women for their beauty and for their gay delicacy, which concealed the firmness with which they controlled everything. With Soullight men he was less enamoured. They were nice enough, but Milton could not forgive them for being the weaker sex. Old attitudes die hard. The new bunch of women and animals, as ever they were mixed together, that Milton was introduced to, began roving around the palace with him. All was wonderfully confusing. Some rooms had an indoor feeling, some an outdoor. The contiguity of flesh and fur was stimulating. The kaleidoscope of colour intoxicated. Milton found himself besieged with questions about Earth. He answered them almost without thought as it grew later, and the procession became a sort of strutting dance. Inevitably the gaiety soaked into him, warming his heart, tempering his pulses. What the Soulites thought of him was clear enough. He was a primitive, odd perhaps, even dangerous, but therefore all the more exciting. Let them think what they liked. They could think he was a caveman, provided this wonderful party went on a little longer. Yet for all his rapture, Milton learned a little about the civilization of which he had become a member, picking up scraps of information dropped in casual conversation. Soullight was mainly a barren world. Half the land between the poles was crater filled with and bereft of soil. In the rest, the Soulites had tried to create their idea of paradise, raising occasional oases among the deserts. Their oases were being stocked with the fauna and flora of Earth, since their own species were few in number. Don't you get plants and animals from other planets in the galaxy? Milton asked. One rich-eyed woman. Just for a second, he thought. She lost her step in the dance. Her green eyes searched him until he dropped his gaze. Only from your Earth, she said, and dipped away from him in a glide. The Soulites reckoned their culture to be 15,000 years old. They had now reached a period of stability, for all their gaiety. Milton fancied he could detect a core of loneliness in them, but finally his sense of difference disappeared in the excitement of the evening. He was becoming slightly drunk, though he drank little. Now the palace was like a mirage, shining with people, glittering with music, its whole architecture adrift with calculated magic. Soon we will move it all the way down to the sea. Amada cried. Such a night is incomplete without an ocean. We will transport shortly to Union Bay. We must have waves and the rhythms of the tide around us. Meanwhile the rooms became hallucinatory. The port matter seemed capable of any miracle, as the delicate servo mechanisms behind them responded to the partygoer's mood. Bright wall drifted through bright wall. Rooms floated up and down among each other, bearing their merrymakers with them, so that stars and snowflakes mingled in a beautiful, impossible storm. An angelfish flew among branches of viridian cacti. Hidden music increased in tempo to match the marching decor with its beat. Then Wanghurst Zont arrived, the last of all the guests. In her hair a magenta chameleon curled, matching the magenta of her lips and the nipples of her breasts. She hastened to Armada and Floyd Milton. She too had been to Earth. She too had returned with a native husband. "It'll be pleasant for each of you," Wanghurst said, beaming warmly at Milton as she clutched his hand. "In case you ever feel homesick, you shall be my husband's best friend, hunting and drinking with him. We don't live far from you. A horse can take you almost as quickly as a portmatter." She brought her Earthman husband forward and introduced him as Chun Hua. As the two men confronted each other, everyone else seemed to fade away, lost in a moment of crisis. Clearly enough, the expressions chased themselves across Chun Hua's face. First an angry dislike, then regret for the dislike. Then embarrassment. A pain searching. Finally a grimace that said, "Well, this isn't any time or place to be unpleasant." With a smile he put out his hand. Milton recovered himself less quickly. Ignoring the hand outstretched to him, he turned vexedly to Armada. "This man belongs to a nation which is at war with mine," he said. A strained silence fell instantly over the whole group. In part, it was a silence of incomprehension. Milton spoke in the Solite tongue, but since to his knowledge that language had no exact equivalent for the words nation and war, he was forced to use instead the equivalents for group and trouble. "How can there be trouble between you?" Armada asked, calmly enough, but with a hint of danger in her voice. "You are both Solite men now. Earth is far away and has no claims on you." The words had exactly the wrong effect on Milton. All his feelings of guilt welled up strongly within him. He clenched his fist, part of him aware he was about to act foolishly. "There is trouble between us," he said. "One of us must leave at once." "This I don't understand," Wanghurst said. She was completely nonplussed by Milton's reaction. "You are both Earthmen." "Have you ever met before?" someone asked. "What are these groups you speak of?" someone else asked. "What is this trouble?" "Stay out of this," Armada begged them all. She turned to her husband. Subiana, her tiger, could not rival her for ferocious beauty when she grew angry. Armada, in her wrath, was at once potently appealing and intimidating. "I wish to know at once clearly the cause of this foolishness," she demanded of Milton. Chun Hua began to explain. His Solite, Milton noted angrily, was more fluent than Milton's own. The concept of nationality seemed above the heads of most of the women present. They belonged to a sparsely populated world where the ubiquitous portmatters rendered segregation into groups an impermanent affair. Armada and Wanghurst, however, having visited Earth, knew something of the terrible weapons of war, and had even seen the start of the global conflict before leaving for Solite. Both were alarmed to find an echo of that fearful struggle here, in their midst. During the argument that followed, they let slip a piece of information previously withheld from Milton, either by accident or design. Now that the war was on, no more portmanteau units would visit Earth. He was entirely cut off from his native world. Chun Hua, urbane and conciliatory, had their ear now. Milton, unable to follow all that was said, found he did not want to listen. Perturbation swamped him, already mazed by colour, light, and tempting women. His brain rocked with conflict. The sense of being alien, of being numb to so much glorious life, was overwhelming. Angrily he turned on his heel and left. Armada made no movement to detain him. In its present state of gay upheaval, the palace was an impossible place for a novice to leave. Milton contented himself with walking as far and as fast as he could, agony of mind goading him on. He was sorry for what he had done here. He was sorry he had left Earth. He loved Armada passionately. Equally, he loved his own land. It was a cruel antithesis to resolve. His thoughts churned more madly than the hidden music. He travelled a long way, pushing through ranks of startled revellers, sometimes being carried back by the rooms, almost to the point he had started from, and then the scene changed. In an attempt to fend off the failure of her party, Amada had moved to Palace. Having been an electronics officer before his marriage, Milton knew something of the complexity behind this seemingly simple transference of location. Nevertheless, even in his present mood, the wonder of it overcame him. The great building was suddenly half submerged in a summer sea. Its rear apartments stood on the beach, its forward ones, like the bow of a doomed ship, sunk under the foam. It was night. An illusion of phosphorescence washed against the walls, and by cunning back projection appeared to float through the palace itself. Under the pellucid waters, the participants in a weird ballet began to arrive. Seals bearing luminous globes, lance-like cometfish, eels, chubs, big purple parrotfish, shoals of doctorfish, dolphins, sharks, manta rays, whirled on to the watery stage. Around the transparent walls they swam, sinking and rising in a curious saraband. "I've got to get home," Milton exclaimed, and turned his back on the parading fish. Breaking into a run, he pressed through the seemingly submerged rooms until he came finally to a chamber that, camouflaged though it was, he recognized. Here he was alone. He pushed his hand through floating bunches of syringa blossom. Behind them he felt a metal box. Opening, chancing a shock, he probed gingerly for the first terminal. The little box contained a scrambler that, on instructions from the computer housed deep down in the foundation, maintained this particular room's cubic contents in their desired spatio-temporal location. Milton, his face pressed into the sweet syringes, wrenched out the wire below the first terminal. As soon as it came away, it dissolved beneath his fingers. The room snapped out of being. Somewhere an alarm began to sound, then it faded out sharply on a dropped octave. The palace vanished. People, music, flowers, the bright facades and terraces, all evanesced. In the emergency caused by Milton's broken circuit, the computer had recalled the entire building to its base inland. Milton fell 12 feet into the slumbering sea. All was silent as he gained the surface. The underwater menagerie had fled. There was only the seabird, killed by the original materialization of the palace, which floated beside Milton on the water. Overhead, Solight's weird moon burned, a pregnant crescent. It glowed red and baleful, like an eye whose pupil swims with blood. Blowing out a mouthful of water, Floyd Milton kicked out and made for the shore. "I'm going home," he told himself aloud. It could be done. The distance to the great port matter units that had travelled to Earth was not great. He could walk it. He would smuggle himself aboard, force them to take him back. The call of duty was suddenly absurdly strong. To get back he would not hesitate to kill. The Solites were alien. Even his beloved Amada could not understand. She would not even tell him such a simple thing as how many light years it was to Earth. Therefore she could not love him deeply. Amada must be forgotten. Perhaps after the war, if there was an after to follow that terrible Holocaust. He needed a weapon. A small pier jutted from the beach. Milton swam to it and hauled himself up a ladder. On the pier, red in the eerie moonlight, stood a wooden hut. Milton broke open the door with one heave of his shoulder. Fortune was with him. Inside the hut hung a skin diving equipment. Fins, goggles, fathometers, and water scopes lay ready for use, and there was one magnificent spear gun. A fortunate concession, Milton reflected, considering the peaceable nature of the Solites. Examining it, he found it was air-powered, and fired a fearsome-looking barb, equipped with a cartridge that would explode upon contact. Scooping up a belt of spare ammunition, Milton left the hut with the gun. Outside, he stopped sharply. Chunwa was coming along the pier towards him. Yes, of course, they would guess what had happened when a fuse blew and he was no longer anywhere to be found. they would hurry back to get him. Baring his teeth, Milton swung the gun up and took aim. Chunwa stopped immediately. "Don't fire," he called in Starlight. "Floyd Milton, please listen to me. I am not your antagonist. You do not understand. Quite evidently, you have not been told as much about this world as I have." "I don't want to hear a thing," Milton shouted. His blood bellowed like surf in his ears. Through the red night, he could discern moving figures on the land. They must be coming to hunt him down. "Hear me, Milton. Don't fire, please. These people have saved us and the animals and plants because the war on Earth will destroy nearly all things. Do you understand, Milton? The Soulites are our—" Milton cut him off with a savage shout. People were crowding down the cactus-fringed beach. They had reached the pier. A few of them charged into the surf, calling his name. He pressed the trigger of the spear gun. Almost at once, the cartridge exploded in its screaming target. Everything went blank, freezing down into a dull uniform grey. For a long moment the director sat where he was in the control booth, hands clasped painfully together. Such was the vivid impact of Floyd Milton's dream that he could almost imagine himself shot by the harpoon gun. When the feeling passed, he jumped up abruptly, recollecting himself to his own world. Something had caused Milton's dreams to be cut off. It should never have stopped so abruptly. With controlled savagery, the director plucked off his visor, dialed the Dreamery's main ops room, and demanded to know what the trouble was. "The ring of Dreamery 5 from which you are speaking," said a smooth robot voice, "has suffered an indirect hit from a Cobalt warhead. All Blanketeers are already in full operation and repair crews are on the job." Glancing through the booth's window into the vault, the director saw the long line of dreamers stirring uneasily. One or two of them were even sitting up. A giant had come and trodden on their pathetic little magic lantern slides. Soon they might all be awake, running about in panic. That certainly should be avoided. The director turned back to the phone. "Inject treble dosage of standard sedative down all feeding tubes in this wing at once," he said. "That would make them sleep like the Seven Sleepers, and a little headache would colour their dreams when their circuits were restored." But to his order there had to be one exception. Hurrying out, the director went across to the prone figure of Floyd Milton. With one swift gesture, he pulled down the double tubes, the silver and the plastic, that bled into the man's chest. More gently, he removed Milton's visor and phones. "Floyd," he said. "Floyd Milton, wake up." Milton's eyes opened. It was like suddenly looking over an empty ocean, grey and sullen and lost. "I'm your friend," the director said, doubting if the other saw him. "I know now why you came here, and I know you're too good a man to waste your life with all these slugs around you. You can face what you have done. You must face it. Men like you are needed on top." "I'm a murderer," Milton groaned. He sat up convulsively. "Oh God, what I did!" "I know what you did," the director said. "I looked in on your dream. You must not call it murder. You did it as a duty to get away." Milton stared at him blankly. "The Soulites brought you back by port matter, making a special journey," the director reminded him. "I was told that much when you arrived here. That proves they cannot have blamed you. They saw by your act of killing that they did wrong to keep you on Solat any longer, and so they let you come home." "You're crazy," Milton said. For the first time he looked intelligently at the director. "They didn't let me come home. They exiled me. They wouldn't have me there one moment longer. They were revolted by me, do you understand? They saw I was a caveman, and obviously I had best go back and die in my own caveman world. It was their civilized way of dealing with a murderer." "But Chunwa, he was your enemy," the director protested, "when you killed him on the pier. You—" A groan burst from Milton. He covered his face in his hands, rocking to and fro. "I did not kill Chunwa," he cried. I killed a martyr, my wife. Brokenly, he recounted the scene. It was the martyr who had come running along the pier in the crimson night. She had tried to take the gun from him, had even pleaded for Chunwa when Milton had threatened to shoot him, and at that, an intensity stab of jealousy had triggered Milton's anger. He fired. Staggering from the dreadful blast, Armada fell over the side of the pier into the sea. The reel on the gun, as the line attached to the harpoon paid out, screeched wildly. At the memory of it, Milton broke into fresh lamentation. The director stood helplessly over him, one hand on his shoulder. Beyond the dreamery, more explosions sounded. The government had promised that this war, to end war, would be fought mainly on the epic waste of the moon. Well, it was not the first time governments had lied. Just now the universal tragedy seemed somehow less than Milton's personal one. So we never found out where Solot is and why it remains out of reach, the director said. Everyone would have been interested to know that once. Blurrily, Milton looked up. Yes, I know where it is, he said. I found out by accident on the journey home. They lent me a technical book on port matters to pass the time. I was too depressed to try and make it out. Threw it aside after opening it once, but one sentence I read there stuck in my memory. It said, matter transmission is practicable only where gravity factors can operate effectively on the broadcast mass, or words to that effect. Sorry, it doesn't mean a thing to me, the director said. It has only one implication, Milton replied listlessly. It means that the port matters will not work between planets where gravitational attractions are low. So you can see that the blood-red moon burned with atomic fires. You can see that it was our moon. When I thought things over, I realized, everything that Solite was what we in English call Earth. That the Solites were only Earthmen, of the same stock we are. That my dear Armada, if I'd only known sooner, was no alien creature at all. The director was deadly pale. Harshly, he broke in on Milton's groans. If this is so, if they aren't space travellers, you are saying they merely came back in time? Milton nodded. For 15,000 years, he said. Then why did they not tell us? Why did they not tell us? Were they mad? Only kind, Milton said. They knew we stood on the brink of supreme catastrophe, and could not bear to tell us so. They are the descendants of the few survivors of a total war. That's why, as soon as they had time travel, which was an application of the port matter formula, they came back to rescue what they could, the birds and plants and things almost extinct from the Holocaust. A loud explosion outside made the dreamery shake. Dust fell from the ceiling. From this Holocaust, he amended. Thank God, the director exclaimed. This is staggering news. This changes everything. Milton looked up briefly, annihilatingly, then sunk his ravaged face back into his hands. For me, it doesn't change a thing, he said.